Hey there, and welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's jump right in. Whenever we think about World War II, we usually picture the exact same black and white newsreels we've literally seen 1,000 times. The big battles, the famous generals, that standard narrative. But what if I told you that some of the absolute most crucial chapters of this conflict have been practically erased from the history books? Seriously. Today we're going to use this explainer as a lesson on some wildly overlooked wartime contributions and secret tactics that are going to completely flip your perspective on the war.
So what if the history books miss the most fascinating parts of the war? We always kind of just assume the historical record is a done deal, right? But as declassified data keeps showing us, history is definitely curated. So let's start by totally challenging our preconceived notions of who was actually fighting in this thing.
Check out this number right here. 2.5 million. Now, that's not the number of artillery shells fired or, tons of supplies shipped. That staggering number represents the 2.5 million Indian Army volunteers who fought for the Allied forces. The sheer scale of that is just mind-boggling, isn't it? And honestly, it's the perfect entry point into our first hidden truth.
Section 1. The Overlooked Allied Heroes.
What's really fascinating here is the contrast. So, a recent Focal data poll actually found that the British public is pretty much in the dark about how diverse the Allied forces really were. Yet 86% of people say they want a more inclusive history taught. And when you look at the real numbers, it's wild. Alongside those 2.5 million Indian volunteers, we're talking about 1 million personnel from Africa, plus tens of thousands from the Caribbean. These groups were absolutely crucial in major battles, in intelligence, and in medical aid. But they're rarely the faces we see in the big documentaries. To really grasp these numbers, though, we have to look at the actual people behind them. Take the heartbreaking story of a Canadian soldier named Private Clarence Alvin Trim. He was born to Guyanese parents in Montreal, and get this, he first tried to enlist when he was literally just 15 years old. He even grew a mustache just to look older. He ended up taking part in the liberation of the Netherlands, but tragically, he was fatally wounded in Germany just 2 weeks before VE Day. He died fighting for a victory in a world that largely forgot the massive contributions of his demographic.
Section 2. Soviet Women in Combat.
800,000. Let that sink in. That is the number of women who served in the Red Army. To put that into perspective for a second, women made up roughly 5% of the entire military personnel in the Soviet Union during the war. Now, the military establishment initially tried really hard to keep women totally out of combat zones, but as those extreme casualties started mounting up, well, things had to shift.
The really crucial point here is exactly where these women were serving. They were the undisputed backbone of Red Army medical care. We're talking 40% of paramedics, 43% of surgeons, and 46% of doctors. And look at that bottom line, 100% of nurses. Every single nurse in the Red Army was a woman.
But listen, their roles definitely were not just limited to medicine. In direct combat, nearly 200,000 women were decorated for bravery. Just to give you a few examples, you had Manshuk Mamotova, who was a machine gunner and actually the first Asian woman to receive the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Then there's Maria Oktyabrskaya. She drove a tank. And Tatiana Kosturina, this is incredible. She had over 120 kills and actually took over commanding an entire infantry battalion back in 1943 after a commander was killed. I mean, talk about completely defying the expectations of the era, right?
Section 3. The Ghost Army Deception.
Okay, so the Ghost Army was officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Activated in 1944, this was a highly classified 1,100-man U.S. tactical deception unit. But here's a catch. They weren't your typical soldiers at all. These guys were recruited straight out of art schools and advertising agencies in places like New York and Philly. We're talking artists, actors, set designers, sound engineers, and this whole thing was kept so deeply under wraps that it wasn't even officially declassified until 1996.
No way, right?
So, how did a bunch of artists fight a war? Well, they fought with illusions. Basically, they put on this brilliant traveling roadshow. Step 1. The 603rd Camouflage engineers would use air compressors to inflate massive dummy tanks, cannons, and airplanes. Step 2, they'd broadcast fake radio signals. And Step 3, they drove around these giant sound trucks playing pre-recorded audio of troop movements. They could literally conjure up entire fake airfields and troop formations in just a couple hours. And the kicker? They'd purposely camouflage them just imperfectly enough so that Axis aerial recon would spot them and think, oh, wow, there's a massive Allied force waiting down there.
Section 4. Animal Secret Agents. Now this is where things get a little bizarre. There's this huge cognitive dissonance when we look at military research. On the left side, you've got exactly what you'd expect. Bombs, missiles, heavy artillery.
But on the right, that's what was actually being tested in some secret labs. Bats, pigeons, and pigs. I know, it sounds completely absurd, but millions of dollars and countless hours were literally poured into trying to weaponize these animals.
These declassified reports are just wild. In 1941, the U.S. military launched Operation Bat, which was exactly what it sounds like. They wanted to attach tiny incendiary bombs to bats. So, they dropped them over a test site in New Mexico, and guess what happens? The bats get loose and actually end up burning down a U.S. airbase hangar and a general's car. You can't make this stuff up. Then you had Project Pigeon, pushed by that famous behaviorist B.F. Skinner in 1940. His grand idea was to stuff pigeons inside the nose cones of missiles. The birds were supposed to peck at a screen to literally steer the missile to its target. Okay, obviously the project was eventually scrapped, but man, it just goes to show you how experimental and frankly desperate some of these wartime tactics got.
Which brings us to Section 5, Forging the Resistance Myth. Take a look at this incredibly famous 1944 speech by Charles de Gaulle. He says, Paris liberated by itself, by its own people, with the help of the armies of France. So what's really happening here? De Gaulle is very carefully equating the entire French population with the resistance. He's actively forging this unifying national myth because he needed to heal a deeply broken country. Notice he makes absolutely zero mention of the Allies or any of France's bitter internal political divisions.
But let's look at the hard data and drop the curtain on that myth for a second. 200,000. That is the actual verified number of people in France who had official resistance cards and entitlements by the late 1950s. 200,000. So out of the entire nation, being an active official part of the resistance was actually a very small minority experience. The vast majority of French people, honestly, just wanted to survive the war and get back to normal life. And what's really crucial to understand here is that historical memory was heavily weaponized for political needs. You ended up with these two competing epics. You had the Gaullist myth, which of course centralized de Gaulle's authority. But then you also had the communist epic. The French Communist Party basically branded themselves as the party of the 75,000 executed to directly rival de Gaulle's narrative. They were trying to maximize their own popular base by claiming this alternative heroism. So historical memory wasn't just about objective facts, it was actively being forged by current political battles.
Moving on to our final and darkest chapter, Section 6, Dark Deals and Cover-Ups.
In the immediate aftermath of the war, something like 18 million Germans had served in the armed forces of Nazi Germany, and that was heavily augmented by drafted locals. Well, after the dust settled, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service frankly failed to adequately screen for Nazi collaborators trying to enter the country. In fact, historical records strongly suggest that up to 10,000 war criminals could have successfully hidden right here in the United States. They just slipped right through the cracks of a deeply flawed system. But, the cover-ups go way deeper than just some botched immigration searches. We're talking about declassified U.S. cash payouts to Japan's Biological Warfare Unit 731. Now, if you don't know, Unit 731 was the infamous Japanese germ warfare unit, and recently declassified American intelligence records from GHQ's G2 intelligence unit reveal something genuinely shocking. The U.S. occupation authorities didn't just quietly grant these scientists immunity from prosecution, they actually made direct under-the-table cash payouts to buy their experimental data.
According to research published in the Asia-Pacific Journal, the U.S. desperately wanted what they called the A, G, and Q reports. That stood for anthrax, glanders, and bubonic plague. Basically, to gain an edge in the looming Cold War biological arms race, the U.S. paid for unrivaled data that had been generated through horrific, lethal human experimentation on prisoners. It highlights a profoundly dark, moral compromise that was kept totally secret from the public for decades.
And that really leaves us with a final, super provocative thought to chew on. If the victors are the ones who write history, and if they can just omit 2.5 million volunteers, if they can ignore female combat heroes, hide armies of inflatable tanks, and cover up secret cash payouts to work criminals, what else has been erased? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning what you read, always look at the data, and never stop digging for the hidden truths of our world.